Good morning, everyone. I hope that you've all had a chance to grab a comfortable seat in the comfort of your own home. We're excited to welcome you today to our Fireside chat with Senator Jane Hume and Alex Scandurra. My name is Cheryl Mack, and I'm the head of community here at Stone & Chalk. We know how important it is for you to have all of your questions answered today. So if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those at the end. There will also be a short survey at the end, so it would be great for you to complete this so we can get some feedback. For those of you who are new to our virtual space, Stone & Chalk was founded in Fintech in 2015. We're a not-for-profit organization, and our mission is to nurture, connect, and propel those who are seeking to solve the world's most pressing social and business challenges. In this sense, our founders, corporates, and industry partners, along with investors and mentors, are shaping the future together. We have a proven track record in developing successful growth and support frameworks for our founders in the emerging tech sectors. This also now includes exciting opportunities such as space tech, prop tech, health tech, and ag tech. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Alex Scandurra. He's the founding CEO of Stone & Chalk. He's a serial entrepreneur, a mentor, board member, and angel investor. He has co-founded Spark Festival, which since its inception in 2016 has grown to become Australia's largest innovation festival. He's also a member of ASIC's Fintech Advisory Board, as well as being on the advisory board for the New South Wales Government's Digital Analytics Centre. And in his spare time, he's also a director of the children's cancer charity Red Kite. Prior to Stone & Chalk, Alex was the head of strategy and business development for Barclays Group in London. He also co-founded the Barclays Accelerator Program, which was powered by Techstars and ran in London and New York. He has also spent over 7 years living and working extensively in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and Europe. And I've been working with him for about 8 weeks now, and I've had the absolute pleasure of being able to do so with him. Today, Alex is taking this opportunity to, during these unusual times, to speak with Senator Jane Hume, Australia's first Minister for Fintech. Alex, I'll hand it over to you to introduce the Senator.
Thanks, Cheryl. And thank you to all who have joined us today. I've got the absolute pleasure of introducing Senator Jane Hume. Jane is a Liberal Party Senator from Victoria. She was elected in July in 2016. She's born and raised in Melbourne and completed a Bachelor of Commerce at the University of Melbourne, later returning to gain further qualifications in political science. Subsequent to graduation, Senator Hume held various positions in the financial services industry, working for the National Australia Bank, Rothschild Australia, Deutsche Bank, and immediately prior to her election as a senior policy advisor at Australian Super. She's also served on a number of boards, including the Royal Children's Hospital, Federation Square, and Perinatal Anxiety and Depression Australia. In recognition of her extensive experience in corporate and philanthropic organisations, on entering the Senate, she was immediately appointed as chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Economics. She also serves on a number of other Senate and joint standing committees, including legal and constitutional affairs, corporations and financial services, and NBN. Outside of her career pursuits, Senator Hume enjoys swimming, reading, and most of all, spending time with her 3 children. Once again, if you've got any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function and we'll get to them at the end. Jane, thanks for joining us at Stone & Chalk again, and welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I think in these COVID-19 days, enjoying spending time with my 3 children is a little bit limited. I think maybe I'd rather they all went back to school right now.
Yeah, I really hear you. I've got 3 kids myself, and I'm really enjoying the fact that they're not around me right now. Peace and quiet. Well, Jane, thanks very much for joining us once again. And I guess the first question I really wanted to ask you, and to also help people get a sense of who you are and what's really driving you right now, is clearly you've had a background in financial services prior to joining the Senate. But what is it that is really motivating you and interesting you right now in terms of your passion for fintech? Why fintech?
Well, to tell you the truth, what really led me down the fintech portfolio route was the Prime Minister. He was the one, when he was Treasurer, that initiated the Consumer Data Right, and the legislation for that Consumer Data Right came before my Senate Economics committee when I was chairing that before I entered the ministry. And I got to know a number of people in the industry throughout that process of inquiry into the Consumer Data Right. Of course, it's the Prime Minister that is extraordinarily passionate, particularly about open banking. He went to the UK, he saw it in action and came back and said, not only are we going to do this in Australia, not only are we going to introduce open banking, but we're going to have an economy-wide consumer data right. And it's not just going to be limited to banking, it's going to be extended to energy and telecommunications and eventually insurance and superannuation. And that's that sort of thinking that I think has really inspired me. And I think that's why we now have Australia's first Minister for Fintech, and it's a role that I thoroughly enjoy, but also I carry with great pride.
Fantastic. And so you've had an opportunity to spend some time going around the country, engaging with a lot of fintechs, and really getting quite in depth in terms of the breadth of fintech and what it's able to offer both the public and the Australian economy. Are there particular areas that you see from what you've been exposed to so far that you think have perhaps a unique competitive strength here in Australia, or potentially also have an important role to play given the current competitive dynamics that are happening in the industry?
Well, I think that, one of the things that has struck me more than anything else is just how unique the Australian fintech ecosystem is. Our product offerings are extremely diverse. Our growth has been tremendous, and it's also been organic, which is really exciting. And of course, the maturity of the industry is also quite impressive. 3/4 of Australian fintechs are now post-revenue. About a quarter of those have year-on-year growth of around 300% or so, which is very, very impressive. So it is a mature industry. And it also has that lovely culture of collaboration, I think, with both challengers and incumbents. But most of all, and this I noticed when I went to Singapore late last year for the FinTech Festival there, it is such a globally focused ecosystem here in Australia too. And over 40% of Australian fintechs already have an international presence of some sorts. Companies like Airwallets and Athena and Afterpay and Judo and I know I'm going to miss dozens, but the companies that are featured in FinTech, this year's FinTech 100, for instance, there's many of them, and there's so many more that are working with Australia's and the world's most foremost banks and governments too. So we're perfectly placed, I think, to become the fintech sector here is perfectly placed to become a leading export growth sector, and of course. In Australia, I think we're quite unique because the centre of our fintech focus is the Australian consumer. And of course, from a government perspective, my overriding objective across the portfolio is to help consumers become better engaged with their finances and also to restore trust in Australia's financial system. And of course, greater adoption of fintech means that the financial system becomes much more inclusive, and it also delivers far better tailored products that suit consumers' needs.
Awesome. And before we get into the COVID specific questions, which is very much the elephant in the room, there was obviously a huge amount of work that we were all embarked on prior to the onset of COVID. And I thought it'd be really helpful for all the listeners and viewers today to really get a sense of what were some of the top priorities that you were working on prior to when the crisis hit?
Yeah, well, look, for the last, it's nearly 12 months now, which is really exciting. But, I've been working on an effective range of initiatives to boost fintech investments, skills, adoption, and also making sure that our regulatory system is as effective as it can be for the fintech ecosystem. Some of this work, as you mentioned, has been delayed, of course, because of our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I have been continuing my work there to ensure that fintech startups and scale-ups during the shutdown, during that period, can be met and responded to. So I think in our coming weeks, the focus is going to be far more on the recovery phase, and that's where it's going to be more important than ever to get the policy settings right to get the capital markets moving, to boost fintech adoption, and to help our companies grow and scale. Now, prior to all of this happening, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the CDR was such an important focus, and that's why we're pressing on with the implementation of the consumer data right. We're still on track. We're still on track to launch. You'll be very pleased to know on the 1st of July, because quite frankly, there's never been a more important time to empower customers, to boost competition in the financial system. We're seeing such an extraordinary number of Australians currently in financial stress, making changes to their financial affairs. Some of that's been good, some of that has been ill-advised, switching, refinancing mortgages, revisiting their investment appetite or their risk appetite, more to the point, and looking at new credit and savings vehicles as well. So the CDR will definitely be at the forefront of helping Australians make those decisions by providing them with the data that they need to make the right decisions for them, and authorising access to that data by accredited third parties. It will allow so many people to find that better deal, use much better comparison apps, and ultimately it will reduce the cost and the time of switching their providers. But at the same time, we also have to have a renewed focus, I think, on data security. That's certainly been an issue that's been in the news from our perspective for a while with the introduction of the COVID Safe app. But that's something that the fintech community have been working on for forever and a day. The CDR framework includes strengthened protections. So we want to make sure that consumers are confident that even if they choose to share their data, it will be kept safe and it won't be misused. Now, I suppose what's most important for everybody on this webinar, Alex, is that we're already looking to the future of the CDR. We're examining how we can expand it to include things like right access. And this will be a major step forward and an extraordinary catalyst, I think, for innovation. And in all areas too, payments, lending, RegTech. It's going to be really exciting. But it will also require us to look at other sectors too, other issues, including things like cybersecurity, consent standards, which was a big issue I know that we discussed in Singapore, and of course the ethical use of AI. So for your constituents, Alex, I think it would be really important if they can, or if they're interested, to contribute to the inquiry into CDR 2.0. We've extended the deadlines for submissions to that inquiry to the 21st of May to ensure that everyone has a chance to have their say. So if you're interested, please, we want to hear from you. Just before we move on, I just want to say there is one more thing that we've been working on, which is really important, and that is building our international links. Because that global collaboration is so important to the core of fintech growth and policy making in the digital economy, building that access and inclusion and promoting growth and competition and improving decision making. That international cooperation is so valuable to the free flow of products and services, but also ensuring that we have effective regulations in place for fintech products that are increasingly globally available. That we launched some time ago the UK Fintech Bridge, the Australia-UK Fintech Bridge, which has helped fintechs into the UK market and facilitating UK businesses to bring their capital and their skills and their products also to Australia. So we're looking to expand that as well to other jurisdictions, establish similar initiatives, and also broaden out the UK model as well. The most obvious example is right on our doorstep, and I've mentioned it before, but that's Singapore. I think what I noticed when I went to Singapore last year was how interested they were in the Australian fintech ecosystem, how they can see that we're an ideal test bed, for want of a better expression, for Asian fintechs who want to enter Western markets. We're very digitally and financially literate. And we have excellent financial inclusion. Nearly 100% population is banked, and we have quite similar demographics to Western Europe and also to to North America. So the Singaporean sector is such an invaluable source of capital and skills for Australian firms, and there really is no shortage of demand for Australian expertise in that market too. So we're going to continue the discussions that we've had with the Singaporean ministers and also the regulators, and to continue to promote investment in Australia, and also regulatory alignment between our two jurisdictions.
Well, certainly more investment opportunities for Australian startups is very welcome, as well as opportunities and help in terms of supporting our startups to export overseas and win customers in markets like Singapore, Europe and North America. I want to draw some attention now to the current COVID response by the government. And I think it'd be helpful for everyone on the webinar to hear from you, Jane, in terms of some of the key measures that the government's put in place so far as the response goes. And no doubt you're aware that, and have been a key part of a lot of the amendments to JobKeeper, for example.
Yes.
And aware that startups in particular that are pre-revenue are still finding themselves, flapping in the wind, if you will, without, some substantive support. So I think it'd be helpful if you could talk about the range of, or maybe some of the key measures that the government's put in place for the sector more broadly. We'll get back to some of those other aspects a bit later on.
Yeah, okay. So I think before I do that, I should acknowledge that this is a very difficult time for Australian businesses, and obviously the fintech sector is no exception. We know that the ecosystem is feeling the pressure acutely. We have problems of low availability of capital. You guys have really quite short runways. There's been falling demand, and I know that you've been making some really difficult decisions in the past few weeks, and we think that that's probably going to continue for some time. I wish I had better news for you. What I can say is that the Morrison government has taken some really decisive and, I think, I hate using the word unprecedented because everybody uses it, but it has been unprecedented action to help protect, all the vulnerable sectors of the economy from the effects of coronavirus. The government support for the economy has totaled $320 billion, which is just an eye-rolling amount of money, and it equates to about 16.4% of GDP. I think that the one that your constituents would be most familiar with, of course, is the JobKeeper package. That's a $130 billion JobKeeper program, and that will support millions of jobs, including startup jobs, and help cushion the blow from the severe economic impact of the coronavirus. It's $1,500 per fortnight, and that's equivalent to about 70% of the median wage. And the program is specifically targeted so that companies whose revenue flows have been impacted by the epidemic will be able to receive support that they need to keep as many employees as possible in jobs. That's the aim of JobKeeper, is to keep the connection between employers and employees. So I have been working with my ministerial colleagues very closely on this, and also with the Tax Commissioner, to ensure that as many fintech startups as possible, and contractors too as possible, will be eligible for the payment. Last week, in fact, we released a number of changes, a more comprehensive set of eligibility tests that encompass new and also new and high growth businesses. So we've extended the deadline too. That's really important, I think. We've also extended the deadline to the 31st of May for applying for the JobKeeper payments. Now, JobKeeper is terrific for companies that are in that post-revenue phase. I think it should cover most of them. But as you mentioned, Alex, for those that are pre-revenue, the reality is that some of them will not qualify for the JobKeeper payments. And while pre-revenue startups potentially have more flexibility in their fixed costs, and maybe actually better placed to weather the storm, we understand that there are enormous and different. So we have a range of support measures that are specifically that aren't specifically targeted at them, but may well apply. So things like the PAYG cash flow boost of up to $20,000 per month may well apply to pre-revenue organisations. There's for those that can access credit, there is a government guaranteed credit facility for low interest loans of up to $250,000. There's a 4-month deferral of PAYG and also of FBT, and there is the instant asset write-off for those that are still investing, and accelerated depreciation for those that may have already made investments of asset purchases. There is assistance from ASIC, from the regulator, including waivers and deferrals of regulatory fees. And there's also further assistance from the states, including things like payroll tax waivers as well. I think that it's important at this point to acknowledge that the amazing leadership and goodwill that has been shown by Stone and Chalk throughout this process. You've really played your part. I know that you're offering your services rent-free too. So it's fantastic when we see organisations like yours working with government and, really sort of stepping up and acknowledging that this is, I hate the words, Team Australia moment. We're all in this together. And so good on Stone and Chalk.
Thanks, Jane. So I thought it'd be interesting to do a couple of polls with the audience today. So the first poll we're going to run is a question regarding JobKeeper. So are you a startup or a scale-up? And do you believe you'll qualify for JobKeeper? So we've got half the audience today is either a startup or a scale-up. And out of those, we have, about 60% potentially would qualify. Well, no, we've got 22% definitely do, 22% don't, and 15 are unsure. Okay, that's interesting. So you'll note that for those who are unsure, we released some communication which was done in collaboration with Senator Hume's office on providing quite a lot of explanation in terms of what has been amended with JobKeeper, and would really encourage you to take a look at that and also contact your accountant. They've been up to date with what the new criteria is, and it's really important. Obviously, it's by far the government's largest support measure through the crisis, and there's something that you definitely want to understand whether or not you qualify for, especially now with the deadline for registration being extended to the end of May. You've certainly got a lot of time to get that advice. All right, so we wanted to run another poll. So how many of you have had customer deals fallen through in the last 2 months? So about 50% have had customer deals fall through. And that's probably representative also of the number that were actually startups or scale-ups as well. So a very small number that haven't had that. So very in line with what we've certainly experienced and heard from members in our extended community. And it's important, guys, obviously, that we're doing this for everyone's benefit to see and understand firsthand what's happening out there across the ecosystem. And the third poll is how many investment deals have stopped or are in jeopardy as a result of COVID. Okay, so we've had about 23% stop, another 38% in jeopardy, and about 2% are okay, and about 40% not applicable. So again, we've probably got, close to, I'd say 90% of the startups and scale-ups that are on the webinar today that have had an adverse impact in terms of capital raising, which is again fairly consistent. So thanks for sharing, everyone. I think it's really interesting for everyone else on the call to also get an understanding of how everyone else is traveling. And so I thought we'd change tact and focus slightly. We've talked a lot about pre-COVID and also some of the measures in terms of response to COVID. And what I thought would be really interesting now is to talk about the recovery. So Jane, from your perspective, and your engagement with the cabinet and the NCCC, what do you consider to be the key things, perhaps, the 2 to 3 things that we need to get right to ensure that we boost Australia's recovery and not just, trickle on?
Yeah. Okay. So you're right, Alex. This is the most important question facing us now. And over the next few weeks, as we move into that recovery phase, we'll be focusing on what it is that we want the economy to look like on the other side of this crisis. It won't necessarily just be going back to normal. This is an opportunity to reshape things so that we're actually in a better place than we were when we walked in. Building the right infrastructure as the foundation stones to support a really successful economy in the next few years, because we're going to need a high growth economy. We understand in that regard that there is that it's fundamentally important to support our fintech ecosystem at all stages, whether it be from pre-revenue or post-revenue to post-revenue, and also to exporters as well. And I suppose then, as the sector's advocate in the ministry, my job is to make sure that you receive the support that you need to keep growing and to keep your teams in jobs, so that you can do what you do best. I suppose, what I want to say is that my door is always open, and I know that, Alex, you've found that in the past, but I want to make sure that it's open to your constituents as well, not just to you, to feel that you have open lines of communication. You've actually already been fantastic with that in the last few weeks. Your feedback has been invaluable, and also it's been very helpful in shaping our emergency response, but it will continue to be important in making sure that we come out of the crisis in the best shape as well. I'm actually really proud of the way that Australia has made such important gains in containing the spread of the virus. But the near-term outlook now depends critically on the ongoing success that we've already had, and our ability to sort of gradually ease those restrictions so that people can return to work. So I suppose it's reasonable then to expect that the pace and the scope of any easing in the containment measures will become clearer in the coming weeks. And we'll also be looking very, very keenly to the forthcoming economic data that will be coming out very soon to get a clearer picture of the effects on all parts of the economy. I suppose there'll be some of you I know that are really feeling the pain, and what we want to say is, hang on. We're working behind the scenes to try and make sure that there is much opportunity there for you as possible. If you can see a glaring gap, please don't sit on it and stew. Come and approach us. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, get in touch, whether it be through the Stone and Chalk team, or whether it's coming to us directly, and Stone and Chalk can certainly put you in contact with me and with my team directly.
And Jane, one of the key themes and topics that comes up pretty much all the time, and especially right now, is in the area of private sector investment. So we're talking about, seed stage and late seed and Series A. One of the concerns that this sector in particular, but I think it's fairly consistent across the board in the startup ecosystem, is that if we take the example of fintech, for example, we've found that anywhere between, say, 70 to 80% of fintechs are enterprise solutions, or they're working through enterprise as channel partners to get to market. And what that means is, for their survival, they need to have large organizations typically be their customers. And it goes without saying right now that large organizations pretty much everywhere across the board are in extreme cost-cutting measures. They're closing down procurement spend, and everything's pretty much that's discretionary or exploratory, for example, is just being shut down as they focus on cost control. So what that says is that for the majority of startups and scale-ups, whether they're pre or post revenue, survival is potentially going to depend on their ability to attract capital to help them, bridge what's going to be an extended gap in terms of being able to, get customer revenue through the door. So where I'm going with this is, I think it's going to be important to focus on unlocking and incentivizing early stage investment like it never has before.
Yeah.
And I know that we've had conversations around the need to improve ESIC, for example. We've had conversations around what can we do more broadly to encourage investment, especially in the early stages. What do you think needs to be done to, and this is perhaps a question of us as well, what do you think we can do as a sector to really communicate the critical importance of the government incentivising early stage investment, so that rather than just relying on the government for grants and subsidies, we're providing incentives for the private sector to unlock their capital to flow into fintech, for example?
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right, Alex. And I think this government has been focused in the past on providing opportunities for capital to better flow through to the innovation sectors, even through things like, business growth funds or, opportunities for equity investment, government making, co-investments, equity investments with banks, and a number of the, structured financing. For instance, the Structured Finance Support Fund behind the scenes during the COVID-19 crisis, that was 15 billion of government investment, making sure that smaller lenders get access to capital so that they can continue with their business and make sure that there's competition in the market. So there's stuff that's going on. How do we unlock more of it? I think that we need to look to our international counterparts and see what it is that they're doing and making sure that we remain competitive, because clearly, this is a very fluid market. It can go anywhere in the globe. I know there's a number of organisations that may sit within Stone and Chalk that could potentially operate in an entirely different country. And I know that Harry, who works with me, has done a terrific international comparison table of, what it is that other countries are offering in terms of incentives, grants, cash flow assistance, whatever it might be, not just throughout the crisis, but also beyond the crisis as well. So that's something that we'll be looking at. I think that an organisation like Stone and Chalk has a really, really important role to play here, because you've already been so successful in building the success of the fintech ecosystem, but your role in advocacy is fundamental too. What we want to do is, even though we're really world leading in the ideas creation space, but I understand we do have a lot of work to do in this more collaboration and commercialisation, and I suppose that's where we want to focus from now on. It's really important that innovation hubs like yours remain strong in this crisis. We want to maintain a skills pipeline, because that will be in short supply inevitably. We want to make things like the Stone and Chalk Academy, is that what it's called? I think, sorry, I've got my...
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Those sorts of initiatives should be encouraged more than ever before too. And look, there's been some interesting opportunities during the ISO experience, I suppose, just like this, where we get a chance to sort of come together and use our mentoring and skills initiatives to do what we do best. There is more to come. I don't want to commit to you online in front of these hundreds of people to exactly what some of those initiatives might be. But what I want to say is that it's something that the government is acutely aware of, and that your continued advocacy in this space is very, very helpful. I would keep an eye out for the October budget. I think that is going to be an opportunity for us to, as I said earlier, lay those foundation stones for a more efficient and free-flowing economy that we are going to need if we are going to create the high growth economy that we need to come out of this crisis.
Well, one thing's for sure, we're certainly going to be intent of working closely with your team in putting forward and recommending a lot of the measures that we see are going to be important, not just in the immediate term, but also in the longer term. We've already been discussing, for everyone's benefit, structural changes to the R&D tax incentive scheme with Jane's team as well. It's recognised that needs quite a lot of change as well, and likewise measures to encourage investment in early stage businesses too. So, appreciate the support and acknowledgement that you've given us, Jane, but likewise, it's important that everyone understands and realises that both yourself and Harry have been doing a tremendous job fighting for fintech and fighting for startups more broadly within government, in terms of certainly the measures that have been introduced with regard to COVID. And if it wasn't for you guys, we wouldn't have those changes and amendments to JobKeeper. And so thanks very much for that. And, we know that you're going to continue to fight for us. I thought I'd also give some time to some of the questions that have started to come through from those that are on the webinar. And so one of them that's being asked here is, Jane, what do you see as the greatest opportunities for superannuation post-COVID? And I know this is an area that's very close to your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, we already had some sort of really big ideas for superannuation pre-COVID. It's a $3 trillion industry, and it has relied for the last 28 years, where it's been compulsory anyway, on a level of opacity and complexity and inertia, I think. But believe it or not, while if you're trying to find a silver lining in the cloud of the COVID-19 crisis, it probably is this program of early release of superannuation has created a new level of engagement, particularly from young people, in their superannuation savings. All of a sudden, people are saying, well, where has that $1.10 that I've earned gone, nearly $1.10, and what's it being invested in, and what's the quality of my investment manager like, and how much do I need to retire on in the future? What's the effect of me taking out $10,000 from my super today? So that's actually a real opportunity for us, I think, to really build on that new level of engagement in the system. Plus, we're also looking at things like, because of its superannuation's origins in the industrial relations system, the default and the default mechanism and the lack of choice in superannuation has been a cause of a number of inefficiencies, and that's why people have things like multiple accounts with multiple sets of fees and multiple sets of insurance that eat away at their balances. We've been chipping away at those problems at the edge, but there's still more to come, and there's some legislation coming up that will change the choice, improve choice, and also we'll be looking at some stage to change the default mechanism to make that more efficient as well. And that will really be breaking the nexus between industrial relations and superannuation. And quite frankly, I've always said that superannuation is a little bit like, it's like a 28-year-old child still living at home. You can be proud of your 28-year-old child, proud of what they're doing and everything else, but at some point you've got to kick them out of home and say, come on, you can do this on your own. Superannuation is $3 trillion. It's, bigger than the ASX. It's 140% of GDP. It does not need the industrial relations system as a crutch. It can do this on its own. And that will make it more efficient for everybody. But of course, the next exciting episode of the CDR, once we get through energy and telecommunications and potentially insurance, sometime down the track, how does the CDR fit with superannuation? I think that's a really exciting opportunity. The other thing that I think that we can do better with superannuation, I know a number of fintech organisations are doing this already, is how do you, create a new level of engagement through gamifying superannuation? How do you do things like, do the sweeps, the roundups that we do for, arrays or something like that, and make that turn that into top-up contributions into superannuation. And from a regulator's point of view, or a policymaker's point of view, and a legislator's point of view, how do we then create flexibility in the superannuation system so that people can contribute more when they can, but also when they can only contribute less, making sure that the system is as efficient and smooth running as possible so that they're not wasting any money when they can't contribute as much as they might like. So there's plenty of opportunities there. Australia's superannuation system is definitely unique. I would like to think it's world leading. I think that it probably is, but it hasn't necessarily been replicated anywhere else in the world either. So I think that we've got lots to learn from other jurisdictions to what's worked over there for their retirement savings too. That's a very long answer, Alex, but it's an area about which I'm very passionate, and it's one where I'd love to see that the interconnection between fintech and super is really exciting.
And do you see, Jane, anywhere in the near term a possibility where there could be some kind of legislative action that super funds are required to offer investments in early stage businesses as an option to their members?
Look, potentially, superannuation firms are compelled to A, act in the best interest of members, and B, invest for the sole purpose of building retirement savings. And for that reason, we don't like to turn them into nation-building sources of capital. We don't want people to say, well, we can build the inland rail. Sure, it'll cost a hell of a lot of money, and it might never make a profit, but we've got all that super money to do it. No, that's people's retirement savings. It's not a sovereign wealth fund. They're individual account holders. Now, if an individual account holder chooses to invest in early stage venture capital or whatever it might be, terrific. I think that's great. But I think it needs to be done in a very, very careful way. There is opportunity, certainly, within self-managed superannuation to invest in those funds that then invest in early stage venture capital or private equity investments. And that exists already. But I think it's never something that we would mandate within superannuation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the nuance there was mandate that they provide the option as opposed to mandate that they invest.
Well,
Okay.
I think that, you're finding that superannuation funds now are already providing options to do things like, ethical investments or, specific sector investments. So, yeah, it's certainly an option.
So to a different question now, and this is one to do with government procurement. So clearly, if we think about fintech even more so, where the majority of what they're creating isn't necessarily a financial product, but is a solution that serves the industry, there's quite a lot that we've seen both here and around the world that is just as applicable for government as a customer. And yet we see a huge amount of resistance still in governments to even adopt that kind of thinking where they would be interested or prepared to create fast-track procurement processes and frameworks that would work well with the nature of startups and scale-ups, for example. But I see this as probably the biggest, carrot that's unserved, in that we're not talking about any additional funding. It actually doesn't cost the Commonwealth or any government any more money because it's spend that's already needing to take place. It's about having the processes and the policies such that it makes that possible and effective. I know that people like yourself, you know that this is a no-brainer from the point of view of, well, if we're able to maximise the government spend within reason, of course, but it still needs to, meet the brief and the requirements and provide value to the Australian citizens. But clearly, it's a multiplier effect if we're able to divert public funding or public spend back to Australian enterprise, which then obviously pays tax and employs people locally. Yeah. What do you think we need to do to get this to be, taken forward seriously within the Commonwealth?
Yes. All right. Well, that's something that I'm actually holding a series of conversations and roundtable discussions about as we speak. I think you're right. It's one of those things we've been talking about for a really long time, trying to, I suppose, bring those responsible for government procurement, whether they be in the public service or whether they be in the cabinet, along for that journey is really important. I think governments are naturally risk averse. So they should be, that's what taxpayers expect. They expect governments to be risk averse. But I also think that there is now a sense of opportunity for and necessity for innovation, and a sense that, sometimes we should invest knowing that there is a chance of failure, because that's when the best outcomes can sometimes occur, can often occur. I think that you find, particularly in government services more broadly, Stuart Robert is the minister responsible, and he has quite an open mind towards this. I think that you find him quite accessible and open to the suggestion that maybe we change our procurement policies and our procurement attitudes. Again, I don't want to overcommit to you or to anybody that's on the line listening at the moment, but I will say, watch this space. This is an ongoing conversation.
Okay. All right. So in terms of some more questions that are coming through, and thanks for answering these, Jane. It's really great. There's one that I think is much more of a personal nature. So one for you, in terms of what resources have you been using to help you lead through this crisis, and what advice can you give startup leaders and founders that are facing these challenging times?
What sort of resources have I personally been using?
Yeah. So, how are you keeping yourself and your mindset positive? How are you managing, to face every day? This isn't an easy situation for anybody in the country, and you're the Minister for Fintech, and right now the sector that you're representing is really suffering. And so, it must obviously also be hard for you personally, given that, you're our representative into government, and that you've been fighting so hard for really helping us succeed. And so I think people are just interested in, what does Jane Hume do to keep herself on the up?
Well, okay, there's a couple of aspects to that question, I think. Look, the first is, in terms of work, I'm surrounded by some seriously smart and capable people here who are all 100% on board Team Fintech. And I know you mentioned Harry before, but I've also got Angus down here, who's an investment banker in a previous life. And we know that there is so much opportunity that you guys can provide, that you'll be such an important part of the recovery process and the new economy when we get to the other side. So, we know we're on the side of good and right here. Yes, there are, the hard part, I think, is, it's heartbreaking when we hear how some of you have slipped through the cracks when the government tries to do something that is so broad brush that it doesn't fit niche sectors. So we've been working really hard, as you said, Alex, to make sure that we can adjust those broad brush policies to suit the niches as much as we possibly can. There'll still be some that fall through, which is really sad. And we want to hear from you, and we want to sympathise with you, even if we can't necessarily help you as much as we can. We'll try and find the solution for you. So I suppose that's the next part of the solution, is to keep those lines of communication open. I like the idea that my office is a facilitator as opposed to a dictator. I think that's really a much more important role that we can have. On a personal level, this has been a really strange time for me personally. I don't mind me going into this. This is a bit strange, but my dad passed away about 5 weeks ago, which was so sad. He'd been sick for a really long time. He had cancer, lung cancer. But he died on the day that they announced that you could only have funerals for 10 people. And so we had this tiny little, it wasn't even 10, it's 8. You could have 2 funeral attendants. So we had this sort of tiny little funeral for a man that was, larger than life. And he was, he's a man that was my hero, and he was my greatest fan as well. And I miss him terribly. But isn't it funny when something like that happens at the same time as the world goes into sort of lockdown and isolation and some changes so fundamentally? I've had to look after my mother and my children at this time, and seeing them come together has been really heartening. You know, Mum's at home with them right now doing their homeschooling, thank heavens, so that I can get out here and speak to you guys and do what I need to do to progress your industry. You know, I think that we turn to different channels of communication. You know, we value things differently at times like this, and we get a new perspective as well. You know, some of the stories that we hear in our office are genuinely heartbreaking, but it's interesting to know that there's pockets of heartbreak all over the place, and you know, you can sort of almost compartmentalize what's going on in your own life and look at what's happening to other people, and you realize, even when you look at the television now, how fortunate we are in Australia. You know, I would rather be here than anywhere else in the world when all of this is going on. So that's like 3 or 4 different answers in one. I'm sorry, Alex, but it has been such an extraordinary time. And, you know, to think only a few short months ago, you know, in my portfolio, we were talking about returning the budget to balance and, you know, highest record level of rates of unemployment and participation rates in the employment sector for women, and, you know, the lowest level of people on welfare in 30 years. You know, these were things we were proud of 8 weeks ago. And now we're looking at $320 billion. The world has changed so quickly. It's hard for us all to catch up.
It's incredible. Yeah. And Jane, have you got, and thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's, you know, it's rare to have someone in your position share things that are personal, and, you know, on behalf of everyone on the webinar, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think it's important that I think for people to get to know who our elected leaders are. And I think there's a lot of strength and leadership in sharing vulnerability. So thank you for doing that. I thought, as we just mindful of time, I thought it'd be interesting and a good idea to really give you a bit of a platform and the floor to maybe share some thoughts or some key messages that you'd like to communicate to everyone on the webinar.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Thanks, Alex. Look, I suppose the final message I want to leave everybody with is, despite the gloom and doom, and certainly there is plenty of gloom and doom out there, it has been so encouraging to see some really terrific good news stories in Australian fintech, even throughout this crisis. You think of things like, you know, Airwallex, who recently closed an extraordinary Series D funding round, and they raised 160, I think it was 160 million US, which was amazing. Zinja is another good news story, who secured over $430 million in investment to help them sort of, you know, leverage their growth for the future. So I think that the message is clear internationally as well as domestically, that, you know, Australian fintech definitely is still very much open for business. The crisis is temporary. We know that that is the case, and the demand for Australian ingenuity will endure. It always will endure. I want, I suppose, everybody that's listening or watching today to know that as your minister, I want to ensure that you have the best support possible so that you can compete on the world stage once we are through this crisis. And we remain totally focused on launching, you know, the CDR 2.0 as well. The Fintech regulatory sandbox is coming online, which is terrific. Growing a new payments platform is something that we've been focused on for a long time too. Building our international fintech partnerships, as I said, with the UK Fintech Bridge, and expanding those bridges, and much more. And I suppose in the months ahead we'll be working very hard to, as we spoke about, boost those capital flows, the regulatory engagement, and also building those international opportunities for the sector. My door is open. We're holding a lot of forums and roundtables that we would really like the sector to participate in as much as they possibly can, to ensure that you get the support that you need. I think that there's probably no better signal to investors in Australia and abroad that the Morrison government's focus and confidence in our fintech system exists by having that fintech minister, and by making sure that there is a great level of engagement with our stakeholders. So, Alex, I want to thank you and to everybody that's on the webinar today for participating in this, because the feedback that we get from you is just as important as the information that we can give to you.
Thanks, Jane. That's fantastic. And certainly want to reiterate that for everyone who's on the webinar. I'm sure we've all been in situations where we've asked for information, we're asked for input, and we provide quite a lot of feedback in many different forms. And then we feel frustrated that it feels like it goes nowhere. I can certainly attest that the information and the reports and the data and the feedback we get from everyone that we've passed on to Jane and her team have certainly been actioned and considered in what's been taken forward. And we've seen some of that already reflected in both, areas like the regulatory sandbox with ASIC, what's moving forward with the CDR, for example, and most recently with JobKeeper. So I can only encourage everyone to make sure that they participate as fully as they can, because we've finally got an avenue into government that, through the Minister for Fintech, for example, is really advocating for the interests of the sector and ultimately the Australian public. And so, Jane, on behalf of Stone and Chalk and on behalf of the wider community and fintech ecosystem, I really want to thank you for your time this morning and for being so open in your answers and in sharing with us what you guys are doing to really help this sector not just survive through the crisis, but hopefully also really accelerate and thrive on the other side. I really want to thank you once again for your time, and thank Harry also for what he's been doing in the background, supporting everyone as well.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks for everyone for having me today.
Terrific. And thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing you all again.